So welcome back, everybody. And it's July 13th, Saturday, nearing the end of the retreat. When we do the practices of sitting meditation and walking meditation, and we live in this retreat format, then it gives the space for things to come up. And sometimes what's coming up can be quite strong. We might feel like we could have done better in the meditation. We might feel like we've failed, we're failures, failed to use the time well, failed to use the time skillfully. And it's probably true. We have failed. You probably weren't expecting me to say that. We are failures. But it's through failing that we learn. It's through making mistakes that we learn. And if we never made mistakes, what would we ever learn? If we never put our hand in a fire, how do we ever learn that fire is hot? Yeah. Our parents might tell us fire is hot, but we don't really know until we put our hand in the fire. So it is through making mistakes that we learn. And so putting the hand in the fire is very much the analogy for suffering. It's through suffering that we learn. So it's important to know that in the path of practice, when we experience suffering and dissatisfaction, it is something that's teaching us it. But it's important to recognize that. If we don't recognize that, there is a danger that we can get pulled into and completely lost in the suffering, in the content of it. So what is the suffering teaching us? What it's teaching us is the suffering feels like this. This is the experience in the body, or even in the mind. This is unpleasantness in the mind. Or we may have been blissed out for the whole retreat. That's possible as well. And we might be sad and suffering because the retreat's coming to an end. So what can that teach us? So partly to tell a good story and partly to help all of you who may have been suffering to feel better about yourselves, I would like to talk about when I think I'd been a monk for about 1 year. I'd been a fully ordained monk for about 1 year. And it's really, this is the one event where I really lost it with somebody in the monastery. And I actually started raising my voice at and yelling at another monk who was a little bit senior to me. It wasn't Ajahn Amaro. He's very senior to me. It was a monk who was just a little bit senior to me. And it was interesting that what triggered it was that we used to sit up in the forest during the summer period, what we call Vasa. We would sit up at this ordination platform for the morning pujas, morning and evening pujas. Really, really wonderful sitting up in the forest, doing the chanting and the sitting in the forest in the mornings, and then either walking down or there was a pickup truck that would take us down. And then we would do our morning chore period and then have breakfast at 7. So from 5 to about 6:20, we would have the morning chanting and meditation. And I had just had the most wonderful morning sit and I walked down the hill feeling like I was floating on a cloud of happiness. And the meditation itself that morning for me, the weather was nice and cool, but not too cold, and it's just perfect. And felt very clear and bright during that meditation period. And then walking down the hill, I was just feeling so good. And then got down for the morning chore period. And at that time, in that period, I'd been involved with organizing some work for the monastery, and I had reported something incorrectly to another monk in terms of like how much we were going to pay a worker. And I had gotten the information wrong. And so during the morning chore period, this other person came up to me and accused me strongly of misrepresenting the truth. And immediately that bliss went into rage. Like immediately. I was like, and my whole body physically just started shaking. And then I just turned around and I went and sat somewhere just doing some deep breathing, trying to calm myself down. And then when I felt like I had calmed down again, then I went to go get some breakfast and it happened again. And I just really lost it. I just, it was bad. It was bad. And then I felt terrible afterwards. So I remember I didn't go to the work period. I just went out and sat on our loop trail and was becoming very emotional and thinking about leaving the monastery. And there was a Thai monk there at that time named Ajahn Prateep, and he found me halfway through the work period and checked in with me, trying to make sure I was okay. But at that time, it was a very insightful period because, the worldly way to deal with a situation like that would be to, well, obviously that person was in the wrong to talk to me like that. and we need to, deal with that in a certain way. But then the Dhamma way to deal with it was to bring it back to the body. So I had been practicing enough that even though I was in a really strong emotional state and really unsettled, when I was sitting there out in the forest and the trail, skipping the work period, so not there for the work period, then I started by doing some chanting. So that's something that could be incredibly helpful if we're experiencing strong emotions. So I started doing some chanting and put the hands together like this. It's actually been proven now that scientifically that putting your hands together like this increases confidence. And I took it back to the body, and then I was trying to pinpoint where the emotion was arising in the body. And I could see that it was like a tight knot in the center of my brain. So it was located in the center of the brain at that moment. The very, very strong emotion. It was like a tight knot in the center of the brain. And when I noticed that, and along with doing the chanting, it dissolved, it broke up. And I felt much, much better. And then I was able to go and join in with the last part of the work period. And it took probably a couple weeks to fully recover from that event, but that was a good start. So I could see that, the mistakes I made that morning in terms of raising my voice, telling somebody off, yeah, that was a failure, but I learned something from it. So just to be careful about getting into that self-judgment. And some of us may have come from different Buddhist traditions, Zen, or Chinese Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, or even in the Theravada teachings in the suttas, it might say that the drawbacks of anger. And yes, those are drawbacks, but sometimes we might have to experience those drawbacks in order to learn from them, or we might see in the Tibetan tradition that if we give rise to a moment of anger, we destroy 100,000 aeons of root virtues. We're not going to feel very good if we get angry and then have that thought. 100,000 aeons. How am I ever going to make that up? And I've been angry not just for one moment, but many moments in the past. Oh, it just seems impossible. This reminds me of a story. It's a story in the Mahayana tradition, actually. I think it's in the Chinese Chan tradition. A monk, and I'm probably going to get the story wrong, but I think I'll be able to tell it good enough that it'll still have some sort of meaning. It's a monk who is working with his mind, and he's sitting on the edge of a cliff. And he's decided that if I can't train my mind, I'm going to jump off this cliff. But he has great virtue, so there's these devas that are protecting him. They're not going to let him do it. So at a certain point, he gets very frustrated with his practice. He's like, okay, this is it. I've made this determination. If I can't train my mind to a certain point, I'm going to jump off this cliff. So he runs and he jumps off the cliff. And then this big hand comes out and catches him, picks him back up and sets him back in his meditation seat. And then he's enraged. Why did you do that? Why did you save me? And then this deva appears before him, this celestial being says, well, you've just given rise to so much anger that you've destroyed any root virtues that could allow me to save you again. So you've just undone all the merits that got built up to have this type of protection and goodness around you. So then he's like, no, and he runs and jumps off the cliff again. And then the hand comes down and picks him up and puts him back in his meditation seat. What? Were you lying to me? What's going on? No, your sense of remorse rebuilt those virtues to the point that you were back where you started. So I think if we relate to it that way, then it is wrong to get angry. It is genuinely wrong. It is genuinely a mistake, a failure. But then we can make that determination. And this is usually how we're taught it in the Theravada and in the Tibetan tradition as well, which I know a bit about because I started out in that tradition. That if you feel remorseful for a genuinely unwholesome, unskillful action, and you make that determination to not do it again, or at least to try your best, that's incredibly wholesome. That's incredibly skillful. We can't necessarily quantify how many aeons we undid of our virtues or how much we've built them back. These would be considered in the Theravada, these would be considered imponderables, things that we can't know. But we can get a sense of what's unskillful and what's skillful. So, back to meditation. This is supposed to be meditation instruction. There is a simile in the suttas that I wanted to talk about. And it comes up when the Buddha is talking about anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing. As our attention becomes more attuned to the breath, and in the Thai forest tradition, a lot of the time they would speak about sensing the sensation at the tip of the nose or in the nostrils or at the back of the throat, wherever it's most prominent. Cool air coming in, warm air going out. And as we become more attuned to that, then the Buddha gives the advice to, just as our turner or a turner's apprentice makes a long turn, one knows, breathing in long, I breathe in long, breathing out long, one knows, I breathe out long, or just as a turner or a turner's apprentice would make a short turn, one knows, breathing in short, I breathe in short, breathing out short, I breathe out short. So this is a woodworking thing. Wood turning is lathing. Some of you may know what that is. There's a machine known as a lathe, and they had them in the time of the Buddha. They would have been treadle powered, and they do still have these. It's like a treadle powered sewing machine, but it turns, wood is two spindles or two pokers, and it's a spindle of wood that turns, and you hold a chisel and you make it round. You can make it perfectly round. And as the wood spins, you can hold sandpaper on it, make it perfectly round and smooth. When you make a long turn, a skilled turner, a skilled lathe worker will, as the wood is spinning very quickly, take that chisel and do a curve in the wood. And if the chisel is very sharp, then sometimes it'll come off as a single piece of wood even. A long spindle of wood will come off, and you can make a beautiful shape, like if you're making a candlestick or a chair leg or whatever. And sometimes you make a long sweeping turn, and sometimes you do a shorter turn if you're making a short divot in the wood. So that's a long turn and a short turn. So I find this analogy or this simile incredibly useful, because just as you can, for me, I can hold that image in my mind of breathing in long, making a long turn. And that helps me to focus on every moment of the breath, because a turner will be focused on every moment of that turn. And then you can go back again and make the divot deeper, and that's breathing out. Or sometimes the breath can be made shorter. When this meditation hall was very hot, I was consciously making my breath a bit shorter sometimes to try to get more cool air into the body and cool myself down. So sometimes it's necessary to make the breath shorter. But that image of turning, of lathing, that can be very helpful for honing the attention and focusing on every aspect of the breath, every moment of each breath. And it can help to sharpen the attention. So breathing in long is like making a long turn on that spinning wood. And the spinning wood is kind of like the mind. The mind is always moving. The mind is spinning. And we're looking into it. We're cutting into it. We're revealing the grain of the wood. We're revealing the grain of the mind. And not only are we creating something beautiful, but useful as well. We're creating something useful. And satisfying. But it takes time and focus, patience. Sometimes if we're not holding the chisel just right, it'll stab into the wood too far and can break a chunk off the wood, and we have to start over. So it's expected that that's going to happen many times. And we just begin again, begin again, begin again. and sometimes the most beautiful wood. So as we go into a piece of wood, sometimes the most beautiful wood is the wood that suffered the most in the past. So you might have certain trees like pine trees or redwoods that grow very fast. The grain is very straight. The wood is very plain. It's still beautiful, but it can be very plain. You take a tree like madrone or manzanita, a slow-growing hardwood tree, and those trees, they bend and they curve and they hold up a lot of weight. And sometimes a huge branch will be bent over and the tree below it will have to compensate. It'll have to grow in different directions in order to hold that huge branch up. And if that tree eventually dies and we work into it, the most beautiful places are right there. At that transition point where that branch was being held up, you could say the tree was suffering at that point. So with woodworking anyway, the beauty comes from the suffering. So not to lose heart when we suffer, we can grow from that. We can grow stronger from that if we hold it in the right way. Sometimes we have to compensate by growing out in another direction to counterbalance the weight of that heavy branch that's jutting off to the side. And we can bring ourselves back into balance. So dukkha, coming back to the etymology of that word, ka being the hub of a wheel, the center, and du meaning off kilter, out of balance, not true in terms of the wheel being not true. It's wobbling. It hasn't been trued. And sukha meaning balance, centeredness, composure. The wheel isn't wobbling. But then there's another level too. Upekkha, perfection. That's when the wheel is really true. So sukha and then upekkha is considered when there's equipoise. We could call it upekkha, equanimity. We could also call it equipoise. So sukha is when the wheel is true, but upekkha is when the wheel is very true, truly true. For any Pali scholars out there in the crowd, I'm not sure if that's correct, actually, but it works for me. Because in the progression of Samma Samadhi, upekkha is considered more sublime and better than sukha. Better than sukha. Yeah. And it's also considered the conditioned state which most closely resembles nibbana. And indifference is not a good translation. And more equipoise, trueness, balance. when we use these tools to practice anapanasati, we can keep some of these thoughts in mind. And so we can sit quietly for about 12 more minutes before the bell is rung, and we can either keep sitting or transition to walking meditation after that. have a brief announcement before we go into the walking meditation. There will be a day-long event in the Community Meditation Center today from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. This event is for self-identified Asian Americans. Please do not enter the Community Meditation Center, and we recommend that you stay above the gate as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To learn how you can support the teachers and Dharma Seed, please visit dharmaseed.org.